So our next speaker has already been introduced. However, Dr. Juris Gro Nystuen's second contribution, please, if we could get started again. Based on Gro's pivotal role in establishing the philosophy of divestment in her former role as head of the Council on Ethics for the Norwegian Pension Fund Global. This pioneering work eventually led to innumerable parallel initiatives in other pension funds and financial companies, setting a standard for keeping out of illegitimate investments. Through her broad experiences in innumerable international legal processes, Gro will also provide some thoughts of the new philosophy of establishing new legal standards that led to the adoption of the ban on mines, cluster ammunition, and nuclear weapons. The themes of Gro's second lecture is the prohibitions on anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions, their legal impact on the nuclear weapons prohibition, and on divestment policies regarding companies that produce nuclear weapons. Again, we welcome Gro to the podium.
Thank you. Okay. So I realize that this lecture has a very complex title. And by the way, if anyone is interested in the PowerPoint presentations that I have made, you are very welcome to them. Give Vidar, or yeah, he'll post it, or I'll send it. So don't get a writer's cramp. All right, so this is a very complex title for a lecture, but it does contain a certain logic, as you will see. Both the processes as well as the content of the two treaties on anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions had a very substantial impact on the new treaty on nuclear weapons. They also had a very big impact, I think, on the recent divestment practices with regard to arms producers of many investment funds. In order to explain how the two treaties on landmines and cluster munitions influenced the making of the new treaty on nuclear weapons, it's necessary to look more closely at the process of treaty making. And the process of treaty making is that the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, which is what regulates treaty law, has an article on this subject, and it says that the adoption of the text of a treaty of an international conference takes place by the vote of 2/3 of the states present and voting, unless the same majority decide that they shall apply a different rule. So the main rule under international law is to adopt treaties by a 2/3 majority. This is the point of departure. This is how most treaties are being adopted. And each diplomatic conference adopts its own rules of procedure. In fact, every conference adopts its own rules of procedure. Not necessarily at every meeting, but some even do that. The main rule for adoption of decisions, as I said, is a 2/3 for substantive decisions and a simple majority for procedural decisions. This is the sort of key formula. And if there is a doubt between which is which, the chair of the conference decides. This is sometimes a very difficult or sensitive issue, and there is a lot of process around that. Everyone who has been party to some sort of institution or organization knows that there is a lot of power in the rules of procedure. If you know them, you can sort of play the game. So, of course, any rules of procedure, its key element is the rule about decision making. There are, of course, many other rules as well, rules on who gets to participate and so on and so forth, order of speaking and so on. But this is the key. Normally, rules of procedure for international conferences contain an obligation to make its best endeavors to ensure that substantial decisions are made by general agreement or consensus, as it were. So this is normal. This is quite normal language in rules of procedure. But then it goes on to say, if consensus cannot be reached, the matter must be decided by a vote. So that is sort of the point of departure. But in practice, there is an exception to this main rule, and that is when vital national security interests are at stake. In these cases, the main rule often is consensus. And that is not so strange, because treaty making and other decision making related to states' vital security interests are very sensitive. A single state or a small number of states should not be subject to majority decisions if those decisions may harm their national interests. That's kind of a principle that follows from the principle of state sovereignty. Of course, states could always have the option of remaining outside a treaty regime, but that too may represent a security problem. So that is why this is, in practice, an exception from the main rule. Consensus may be something which is a formal requirement, or it may be what is an actual requirement. For example, in the NATO, in the CD, the Conference on Disarmament, in the CCW, which is the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which I'm coming back to, the ATT, for example, and other areas pertaining to national security, there is a formal consensus requirement in the rules of procedure themselves. Some other places, it's an actual requirement. For example, the NPT has rules of procedure that allows vote at the review conferences, but this is never done. It is unthinkable for the NPT to actually adopt something with a vote, at least if one of the nuclear weapon states are not on board. So, on the one hand, consensus means that no one can be overridden by a majority, which may be seen as a good thing. But on the other hand, consensus also means that often a very small minority of states gets to dictate the outcome. And this is the background for the process on anti-personnel mines in 1997, or actually it started in 1996. Because the negotiations in the CCW on a protocol on anti-personnel landmines failed, because there was a consensus requirement. And it was not possible to get a ban on AP mines. One only managed to get regulations on use. And this was in 1996. And the same year, the Ottawa process was launched. Simply out of frustration that it was not possible to get a prohibition on this really bad weapons. I'm coming back to that a little bit. If you look at this picture, I'm not going to go through everything here, but this is a number of arms-related treaties, and it sort of says, how have these treaties been adopted? You see the last column there, adoption of the treaties. So you see most of them have been adopted by consensus, except the two that I've mentioned, the Mine Ban Convention and the Cluster Munitions Conventions. They were adopted through rules of procedure, which allowed for a 2/3 majority vote. When you see that there is a sort of an X between the CTBT and the ATT, it actually means that those treaties were not adopted because of the consensus rule. They were not adopted in the diplomatic conferences that negotiated them, because some states blocked. So what happened was that some other states sent them to the General Assembly for adoption, and so the General Assembly adopted these treaties. Now for the ATT, that was good because it is now in force and operating. The CTBT, as I said before, is not in force because US and Russia is not going to ratify it. So this is just a brief explanation of how the consensus requirement has been present in a lot of in a lot of treaty making. Now, during the 1970s, or possibly even further earlier, there were discussions on prohibiting certain weapons that were deemed to be incompatible with these rules of international humanitarian law that Lou was talking about. And the background was, at the time, particularly the wars in Southeast Asia. Later, it was also Kosovo, Lebanon. But the fact was that there were a lot of explosive remnants and anti-personnel mines that were killing civilians long after the hostilities were over. So in the end of the 1970s, there were discussions in the UN on this convention on certain conventional weapons. And this convention was aiming for a prohibition on weapons that did not comply with these very basic rules of distinction and of excessive injury. And this convention was adopted in 1980. And this is a framework convention. So the convention itself is sort of empty, and then it has optional protocols. And as you can see, the title is Conventions that may be deemed to be excessively injurious or to have indiscriminate effect. So this is directly linked to the principles of IHL. Now, the 5 protocols are a protocol on non-detectable fragments, which are plastic fragments which cannot be found on X-rays, which are obviously serving no military purpose, but leads to excessively injurious damage for soldiers. This is in bold because it is actually a prohibition, it's a ban. The next one is on incendiary weapons, napalm and the likes. This is not a ban, it is a regulation. And that was, of course, also because of the consensus requirement. It was difficult to get an agreement on that. The third one is on blinding laser weapons, which is also a ban. These are weapons which were never actually put into use. And here we're talking about permanently blinding weapons. Then we have the protocol on landmines, the amended protocol from 1996, which did not succeed in banning them, but only regulating them. And then there is the final protocol from 2003 on explosive remnants of war, which does not really ban anything, but it applies to clearing up explosives after a war. So the CCW is a good example of how the consensus requirement in the rules of procedure means that it's very difficult to actually get prohibitions, which some states might find difficult. I think when it came to the anti-personnel mines and the discussions in the CCW, this was an example of a weapon that Lou was describing, which effects could not be controlled in space or time. There were AP mines remaining for decades after the conflict was actually over. So the Ottawa process started in the wake of the CCW failure to ban anti-personnel mines. And one of the first things that was done during that process was to ensure that there were rules of procedure for this process which did not involve consensus. That was the key to the success of the adoption of the treaty. And it's actually I was part of the process from Norway's side at the time. I was at the MFA. And I remember very well that the US came to us with arguments that they could not protect Norway if they did not have anti-personnel landmines. It was security-related arguments. But then more and more voices, also actually from the military itself, started to doubt the military usefulness of anti-personnel mines. And of course also saw the enormous humanitarian problems that they created. And 10 years later, we had the cluster munitions process, which was called the Oslo process because it was started in Oslo. One might say that this had been in the making for a long time, but it was maybe triggered by the bombings of Lebanon in 2006, and also a frustration at the time of not being able to do anything with the issue of cluster munitions in the context of the CCW. And again, one of the first things that was done here was to ensure that the rules of procedure would allow for a 2/3 majority vote. And now, of course, the blueprint was the mine ban treaty. Cluster munitions had much the same effect as AP mines, only that they were more dangerous because they're bigger and they have bigger explosive effects. And they worked a little bit like anti-personnel mines because they functioned as minefields in effect. Undetonated cluster munitions would prevent people from using agricultural areas, for example. And one might say that anti-personnel mines killed civilians because they worked as intended. They're supposed to be triggered by the victim, whereas cluster munitions killed civilians because they malfunctioned. They did not detonate on impact, but still they were triggered by the victim. So it's kind of working in the same way. So process affects substance. That's really my point here. There were no votes that took place at the diplomatic conferences on anti-personnel mines or on cluster munitions. But the result lay in the fact that less than a third of the present states wanted a weaker treaty. And this was not a given. There was a lot of negotiations and arm twisting and so on going on at both conferences. Of course, one didn't know for sure whether it was going to be a success. Many states tried, or several states at least, tried to water it down, and they tried to push smaller countries to vote again. But in the end, there was a majority for the stronger text, and there was no vote. I am very strongly convinced that had there been a consensus requirement here, there would not have been any prohibitions on either personnel mines or cluster munitions. So Bonnie talked a little bit about the term humanitarian disarmament. This is a term that emerged in the wake of the AP Mine Convention and the Cluster Munitions Convention. It noted a shift in the way that states looked at these weapons. The weapons represented enormous humanitarian problems that couldn't be justified militarily. When it came to landmines, for example, in 1996, it was estimated that someone was wounded or killed by an anti-personnel mine every 20 minutes somewhere in the world. Very often, women and children. In Southeast Asia, in Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam, over 400 million submunitions were dropped over these countries during the 60s and 70s. And there are still around 80 million undetonated submunitions today. 300 people die every year in Laos because of these cluster munitions that were dropped in the 70s. Cluster munitions were used also in the beginning of the operation in Afghanistan. And I think because of these staggering humanitarian problems, the issues of the weapons were more and more moved from the security field to the humanitarian field, where they truly belonged. And in the Norwegian MFA, I'm proud to say, although I don't work there anymore, but the issue of cluster munitions and landmines were moved from the security department to the humanitarian department, which was a result of this shift in the regard of these weapons. So, of course, again, as Bonnie was saying, the humanitarian perspective on nuclear weapons was very important. It was the way to change the discourse, to move the issue from the security politics area over to the humanitarian area, and to expand the group of stakeholders to the issue. It is no longer just the people who are interested in security politics who gets to discuss nuclear weapons. It's everyone who are concerned with the humanitarian consequences. And I think both states and civil society and academia had been stuck in debates on nuclear deterrence and security issues for many decades, and nothing much had really happened. And the game changer was to move it into the humanitarian field. So to move a little bit over to the issue of financing or divestment, it's important to look at how these two treaties, the Mine Ban Convention and the Convention on Cluster Munitions, were sort of framed. And because also these two treaties were the main sort of inspiration for the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty. And these treaties again were based on the formula from the biological weapons and the chemical weapons prohibitions. So they come from a sort of same tradition. And the main content of the treaties is that states parties never under any circumstance must use these weapons or develop, produce them, etc., or to assist or encourage anyone in using them. That's what I'm going to come back to. I just want to point your attention to the first point, which says never under any circumstance, which means that the treaty here is always applicable. It is not limited to situations of armed conflict, as is the case with the CCW, for example. So it applies always. So the main content of the conventions is, as I said, they're always applicable. They contain a prohibition on use, on stockpiling, production, development, transfer, etc., and on assistance. And then there are the sort of disarmament element, obligation on stockpile destruction. All stockpiles has to be destroyed. Also obligation on clearing of contaminated areas and obligations on victim assistance that Bonnie has referred to. Coming to the complicity provision, as one might call it, or the prohibition on assistance. This provision was taken from the Biological and Chemical Weapons Convention. And this is very strong language for a treaty. Treaties normally do not have this kind of complicity provisions in them. And it was possible at the time because nobody wanted to be, make it legal to assist anyone in using biological or chemical weapons. That was a very universal condemnation of these weapons that made it possible to get this kind of really strong language into those treaties. And then when the Mine Ban Convention came, it was very difficult to back off from this language, So it was kind of taken into the Mine Ban Convention as well as the Cluster Munition Convention as very strong language on complicity. And there are many legal issues that arise from the assistance or the complicity provisions, and I'll address a couple of them. First of all, which was the most prominent one, is the issue of cooperation between states parties and non-state parties in military operations. The second one, which I'm going to talk a little bit about also, is the issue of investments or financing of the production of AP mines or cluster munitions. I would say in the Mine Ban Convention negotiations, this was a very difficult issue because states that wanted to remain outside, for example, the US, which were actually party to the negotiations in Oslo on the Mine Ban Convention, they wanted to, of course, avoid any kind of complicity provision because they were afraid that it would hamper military cooperation. And there were especially two areas that sort of arose from that. It was possible to say that on the individual level there could be criminal responsibility. Let's say if a soldier in a military operation from Norway assists an American soldier in transporting cluster munitions, for example, it would not be a violation for the US because they're not bound to the treaty, but for the Norwegian soldier, it could be a violation of the complicity or the assistance provision, and he could encounter personal criminal responsibility because of the Norwegian criminal law, which has incorporated the treaty. The other level is on the state level, that the state could be seen as violating the treaty through these kinds of actions by their soldiers. So that was one issue, and it was dealt with more thoroughly in the Cluster Munitions Convention in Article 21, which I'm not going to go into here. But in addition to the military implications, the issue of financing, as pointed out by Bonnie, has arisen by this assistance or complicity provision. And I'm just going to mention the ethical guidelines for the Norwegian pension fund because this is sort of where I come from, but I'm aware that there are very many other guidelines and funds who are more or less doing the same thing. But in Norway, interestingly, the complicity provision in the Mine Ban Convention triggered the debate in Norway around 1999 on whether it would be a violation of this provision to invest in a company that produced anti-personnel landmines by the Norwegian pension fund. This was a company called Singapore Technologies, and they produced anti-personnel landmines, and the Norwegian oil fund was invested in it. And some journalists picked it up, and it created a big debate in Norway, who had a very high profile in the negotiations on the landmines treaty. And so it was seen as very sort of hypocritical to, at the same time, being invested in landmines production. And it was a bit of a scandal, I would say, almost. And it triggered a debate on ethical guidelines for the Norwegian pension fund to sort of look at how could this issue be dealt with. And so the ethical guidelines that then were later adopted in Norway for the pension fund, which is now one of the world's largest funds, had two sort of different approaches to exclusion of companies from the portfolio. The first one was product-based and the second one was conduct-based. The product-based contained weapons, tobacco, and certain military equipment. And the second one was more of relating to human rights violations, IHL, environmental damage, corruption. And so I'm not going to look at that. I'm just going to look at the weapons criterion. So the weapons criterion in the guidelines says that the fund shall not be invested in companies which themselves or through their entities produce weapons that violate fundamental humanitarian principles through their normal use. So that is what it says. And then the Parliament, through its discussions and in the white paper, defined which weapons would be on this list. And this is how the list looked like in 2004. So first of all, it was a list of prohibited weapons. And again, we're in 2004. The list contained AP mines, biological weapons, chemical weapons, blinding laser weapons, and non-detectable fragments. And the weapons that are in italics are weapons that are not produced by listed companies. So they don't really mean anything to any fund, but they're just there to make the picture complete. Then there was a list of the weapons that had yet not been prohibited by 2004, which contained nuclear weapons, cluster munitions, and incendiary weapons. So all of these weapons are banned from the fund. The entire list was based on the three principles that we have discussed: distinction, proportionality, and excessive injury. This list caused some debate in Norway, Particularly the Ministry of Defense was skeptical to the exclusion of nuclear weapons, obviously because we were under the NATO umbrella and our NATO membership. But at the same time, it was very difficult to argue that nuclear weapons was not, through its normal use, violating fundamental humanitarian principles. So in the end, this is what was agreed. There is a link between the complicity provision, therefore, and the divestment trend, at least in Norway, a very clear link. There are a clear trend now that many investors divest from certain weapons, including nuclear weapons. But it has never been decided by a court of law whether investment in, for example, cluster munitions would constitute a breach of the complicity provision. I agree with Bonnie that many states have said, and probably even more states have said it with regard to the nuclear weapons treaty, that they consider financing of nuclear weapons production to be a violation of the complicity provision. And that is good because it gradually will grow into customary law, maybe in some time, that the assistance provisions actually cover financing. What happened here in Norway was that the former, I should say, there was an advisory council on international law for the oil fund, which said about this issue, about the Singapore Technologies investment, that it couldn't be excluded that investment in AP mines would be considered to be either assistance, encouragement, or inducement. And so the preparatory work on incorporating the AP mines and the cluster munitions conventions in Norwegian law says the same thing. It cannot be excluded that financing could constitute a violation of the complicity provision. And so, thereby saying that, in fact, financing is covered, but not specifying how it is covered, which is a very complicated question, but at least that the principle is there. Very many, I think actually that's true. Very many funds, at least responsible funds, are divesting from nuclear weapons producers. There is a very good report called "Don't Bank on the Bomb," which is easy to find on the internet, which gives an overview of companies and investors regarding nuclear weapons. So in Norway, this policy of the Norwegian Oil Fund was triggered by the complicity provision in the AP Mine Convention. Since 2005, many companies have been excluded from this fund and other funds because of this. And I think this has contributed to the norm of the unacceptability of nuclear weapons. So just to sum up, it's important, as Bonnie was also saying, the framing of the issues as humanitarian and not security policy has been very important. Of all of these conventions that is on this list, only, I think, biological and chemical weapons processes, it was not so prominent, the humanitarian arguments. But in the CCW, in the AP Convention, in the Cluster Munitions Convention, and now in the Nuclear Weapons Convention, it has been very decisive. And I think the two conventions on anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions had a very important influence on the nuclear weapons process. Firstly, because of the framing of the issue as humanitarian, and that's the most important part. But secondly, the process that it was clear from the start that in order to be able to do anything, you would have to have a rule of procedure that said you could vote instead of consensus. And this was possible because you could frame them as humanitarian issues and not issues of national security. And so those were the two singular most important elements, I think, that made it possible to embark on the process and to actually achieve this prohibition on nuclear weapons. And in that respect, I think it's important to note that apart from chemical weapons convention, and not even that completely, but these are not universal bans. Several of them do not. There are many states and some very important states that have remained outside. But I just realized last week that President Trump now has made a new decision to stop the US self-inflicted moratorium on use of cluster munitions. And that, of course, is evidence of the fact that the cluster munitions prohibition actually had a very big effect on the US, at least for many years, and that he actually has to make a decision on reversing it. So it means that the prohibitions have significant effects also for those states who are not party to the treaties. And that, I think, is one important point to bring into the discussion also on nuclear weapons, that it will stigmatize the weapons and to make them more unacceptable. And also, in addition, the very strong complicity provisions in the treaties, which was inherited from the Biological and Chemical Weapons Convention, those made it possible to argue that financing and investment in producers of these weapons was not only morally wrong or ethically wrong, but could actually be a breach of international law. Thank you.